Hi and welcome back everybody. Today we are going to watch a video from CrashCourse, The War of 1812. As a European, I don't know much about that specific topic because we in Europe are more focused, just a little bit of context, that's the year, one of the years of the Napoleonic Wars. So they were from 1803 until 1815. And so we are more focused on the military advancements that Napoleon had in Europe than what happened in North America. So this was suggested in the comment section below. So and I decided to take it, to watch it with you guys. And if you have any idea for a video or a topic that we can discuss or watch together, please let me know in the comment section below. So yeah, we are here to learn something new, and don't be angry as, I don't know, British, Canadians or Americans, because if I comment something, as I told you, like, I know more about the war in Europe during that time than in the US. The things that I know, like in general knowledge and what we learned, is that some consider this war like the Second War of Independence for the United States. The British also supported the Indians to fight off, so they were like a proxy ally, let's call them that way. And the most battles were fought around the Niagara Lakes, like between the today's Canadian and US border. The president back then, 1812. Was it Madison? I think it was Madison. 1812. Yeah, 1812. I think it's Madison. And with the European context, so the Napoleonic War started with 1803, and with 1812 Napoleon actually wanted to invade Russia, or he invaded Russia, where the French Grande Armée suffered its biggest defeat because of course the Russian winter. And yeah, if you have something interesting to add to it, or you want me to know about as a Canadian or British or American, please let me know in the comment section below, because we're all here to learn something new. And yeah, you just jump in. And as always, I'm going to put a link in the description below, so please check them out, CrashCourse. Give them a view, a like, and look at the other content, and if you like them, you can also subscribe to them. So don't be angry if I get something wrong or whatever. Okay? Yeah. Let's just jump in. Oh, and in 1803, I think 1803, Louisiana was bought from the French because Napoleon wanted to focus on Europe, so he sold Louisiana to the US. And actually during that time, and way back with the Independence War and that, the US actually had a good relationship with France, because they helped them in the Independence War, and they sold them also Louisiana, and the US was also trading heavily with France, especially with cotton. So their relationship was actually good as far as I know. So, but okay, let's just jump into the topic.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to talk about what America's best at: war.
War.
Mr. Green, the United States has actually only declared war 5 times in the last 230 years. Oh, me from the past, you sniveling literalist. Well, today we're going to talk about America's first declared war, the War of 1812, so called because historians are terrible at naming things. I mean, they could have called it the Revolutionary War Part 2, or the Canadian Cataclysm, or the War to Facilitate Future Wars. But no, they just named it after the year it started. I know this disappoints the military historians among you, but as usual, we're going to spend more time talking about the causes and effects of the war than the actual, killing parts, because ultimately it's the ambiguity.
Yeah, I know also that Washington was burned down in 1814 by the British/Canadians.
Of the War of 1812 that makes it so interesting. The reason most often given for the War of 1812 was the British impressment of American sailors, whereby American sailors would be kidnapped and basically forced into British servitude. This disrupted American shipping. It also seems like a reasonably obvious violation of American sovereignty, but it's a little more complicated than that. First of all, there were many thousands of British sailors working aboard American ships, so many of the sailors that the British captured were in fact British. Which gets to the larger point that citizenship at the time was a pretty slippery concept, especially on the high seas, like papers.
And probably the British sailors who went to the American ships didn't want to join the war.
Were often forged, and many sailors identified their supposed Americanness through tattoos of, eagles and flags. And there were several reasons why a British sailor might want to become or pretend to be an American, including that the Brits at the time were fighting Napoleon in what historians, in their infinite creativity, called the Napoleonic Wars. And on that topic, Britain's impressment policy allowed them both to disrupt American shipping to France and to get new British sailors to strengthen their war effort, which was annoying to the Americans on a couple levels, especially the French-loving Republicans, which is a phrase that you don't hear very often anymore. Another reason often given for the war was America's crazy conspiratorial Anglophobia. There was even a widespread rumor that British agents were buying up Connecticut sheep in order to sabotage the textile industry, lest you worry that America's fascination with conspiracy theories is new. So those pushing for war were known as war hawks, and the most famous among them was Kentucky's Henry Clay. They took the impressment of sailors as an affront to American national honor, but they also complained that Britain's actions were an affront to free trade, by which they meant America's ability to trade with Europeans other than Great Britain. And to be fair, the British were trying to regulate American trade. They even passed the Orders in Council, which required American ships to dock in Britain and pay tax before trading with other European nations.
Yeah, and as I told you, both sides used trade as a war method. So the British didn't want the US to trade with France, and France didn't want European nations to trade with Britain, so the continental blockade. So actually the tactics are pretty much the same.
Britain, we were an independent nation. You can't do that kind of stuff. We have a special relationship. It's not that special. But the problem with saying this caused the war is that the orders had been in effect for 5 years before the war started, and they were rescinded in 1812 before the U.S. declared war, although admittedly we didn't know about it because it didn't reach us until after we declared war. There was no Twitter. Another reason for the war was Canada. That's right, Canada. Americans wanted you, and who can blame them with your excellent health care and your hockey and your first-rate national anthem. Stan, this is fun, but enough with the hashtag 1812 problems. According to Virginia Congressman John Rudolph, agrarian cupidity, not maritime rights, urges the war. We have heard but one word: Canada. Canada. Canada! I'm not here to criticize you.
What? What, was there a big animosity back then between Canadians and Americans? Or... I don't get it, or I really don't get it. Maybe the US was focused on Canada because they were also English speaking and they wanted to liberate them also and incorporate them into the US. So please, guys, give me some context here because I really don't know it.
You, John Randolph, but that's actually 3 words. Now, some historians disagree with this, but the relentless pursuit of new land certainly fits in with the Jeffersonian model of an agrarian republic. And there's another factor that figured into America's decision to go to war: expansion into territory controlled by Native Americans. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. I try to guess the author of the mystery document. Usually I'm wrong and I get shocked. All right, let's see what we got here. You want, by your distinctions of Indian tribes and allotting to each a particular tract of land, to make them to war with each other. You never see an Indian come and endeavor to make the white people do so. It's Tecumseh, drop.
And it's actually, as I told in one of my previous videos, it's a common tactic by either big countries or empires to go into local conflicts inside of a territory or a state or whatever, and then support one side. And then as those two sides fight and get weaker and weaker, they would either exploit the winning side, so make some arrangements with them to export some materials or whatever, or the empire or the big state would then come in to the weakened territory because they were weakened by fighting each other, and then they would take control over it. So I think that the US had a big policy of that, like empire policy towards Indians, where they would go into local conflicts and support one side over the other, and then just jump in and conquer both of them. And Indians were also a big part of the war, as I know.
Off the mic is something that I would do, except that the mic is actually attached to my shirt, so there's no drama in this. Clearly a Native American criticism of white people, and I happen to know that that particular one comes from Tecumseh, and I don't get shocked today. So it shouldn't come as a...
wasn't he the leader of the Indian tribes who fought against the Americans in that war? Tecumseh. He's probably going to explain, but I think that he was the leader of the Indian militias or forces that fought the Americans.
Surprised that Americans were continuing to push westward into territory where Indians were living. I mean, this was a big reason for the Louisiana Purchase, after all. By the beginning of the war, more than 400,000 settlers had moved into territories west of the original 13 colonies, and they outnumbered American Indians by a significant margin. Some native groups responded with a measure of assimilation. Cherokees like John Ross wanted to become more civilized, that is, more white and farmery, and some of them did even adopt such civilized practices as written languages and slavery. The most civilized practice of all. People are always like, why aren't you more celebratory of American history? Well, why isn't there more to celebrate? But other Indians wanted to resist. The best known of these were the aforementioned Tecumseh and his brother Stan, can you just put on the screen? Yes, let's just enjoy looking at that. Right, that's just for all you visual learners. So he was also known as the Prophet because of his religious teachings and also because of the pronunciation issues. The Prophet encouraged Indians, especially those living in and around the settlement of Prophetstown, to abandon the ways of the whites, primarily in the form of alcohol and manufactured consumer goods. So stop drinking alcohol and eating refined sugars. This guy sounds like my doctor. Tecumseh was more militant, attempting to revive Neolon's idea of pan-Indianism and actively resisting white settlement. As he put it, sell a country, why not sell the air, the great sea, as well as the earth? Did not the Great Spirit make them all for the use of his children? The Americans responded to this reasonable criticism in the traditional manner, with guns. William Henry Harrison destroyed the native settlement at Prophetstown in what would become known as the Battle of Tippecanoe. He would later ride that fame all the way to the presidency in 1840, and then, spoiler alert, he would give the longest inauguration address ever, catch a cold, and die 40 days later. Let that be a lesson to you American politicians. Long speeches, fatal. So I've just painted a pretty negative picture of the Americans' treatment of the Indians because it was awful, but I haven't mentioned how this relates to the War of 1812. The Americans were receiving reports that the British were encouraging Tecumseh, which they probably were. And the important thing to remember here is that the War of 1812, like the 7 Years' War...
Of course, as I told you, like, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, so just use the Indians as some kind of proxy warfare.
And the American Revolution was also a war against Indians, and as in those other two wars, the Indians were the biggest losers. And not in the cool way of the biggest loser where like Trainer Bob helps you lose weight, but in the really sad way where your entire civilization gets John C. Calhoun. So the War of 1812 was the first time that the United States declared war on anybody. It was also the smallest margin of...
And I think that it's technical because, like, the War of Independence, the U.S. wasn't technically a state. They were still colonies. Don't judge me. But they couldn't declare war. That it was just like a revolution. You know, like BAM! And here you have established institutions like the Congress. I think that in the U.S. only the Congress is allowed to declare war. So they had already the Congress, the Senate, the President, so they could technically declare war.
of a declaration of war vote, 79-49 in the House and 19-13 in the Senate. Northern states, which relied on trade a lot, didn't want to go to war, while southern and western states, which were more agrarian and wanted expansion to get land for farming and slavery, did. The closeness of the vote reflects a profound ambivalence about the war. As Henry Adams wrote, "Many nations have gone to war in pure gaiety of the heart, but perhaps the United States were the first to force themselves into a war they dreaded, in the hope that the war itself might create the spirit they lacked." Don't worry, Henry Adams. In the future, we're going to get pretty gaiety of heartish about war. Anyway, as an actual war, the War of 1812 was something of a farce. Let's go to the thought bubble. The U.S. Army numbered 10 to 12,000, and its officers were sunk into either sloth, ignorance, or habits of intemperate drinking. The U.S. Navy had 17 ships. Great Britain had 1,000. Also,
what? 17 against 1,000? I guess that the British were then very successful in blockading American trade in the oceans, in the ocean.
So America had very little money. Britain collected 40 times more tax revenue than the U.S. But Britain was busy fighting Napoleon, which is why they didn't really start kicking America's butt until 1814, after Napoleon was defeated. Napoleon's defeat was also the end of the practice.
Yeah, in 1814, Napoleon lost. He was sent to the island of Elba, and the Bourbons, the monarchy, or the Bourbon family, was reinstalled in France, but he actually came back, and then in 1815, after the Battle of Waterloo, he was again defeated. So the French were defeated, and then he was sent to St. Helena, the island where he eventually died.
Of impressment, since Britain didn't need so many sailors anymore. Initially, much of the war consisted of America's attempts to take Canada, which any map will show you went smashingly. Americans were confident that the Canadians would rush to join the U.S. When marching from Detroit, General William Hull informed the Canadians that, quote, "You will be emancipated."
Detroit is actually directly on the border, also still today, or? Yeah, I think so.
From tyranny and oppression and restored to the dignified station of free men. And the
in Michigan.
Canadians were like, yeah, we're okay actually, and so the British in Canada, with their Indian allies, went ahead and captured Detroit and then forced Hull's surrender. America's lack of success in Canada was primarily attributable to terrible strategy. They might have succeeded if they'd taken Montreal, but they didn't want to march through northern New York because it was full of Federalists who were opposed to the war. Instead, they concentrated on the west, that is, the area around Detroit, where fighting went back and forth. The British found much more success, even seizing Washington, D.C. and burning the White House. In the course of the battle, British Admiral George Cockburn, overseeing the destruction.
So I'm really interested, like, do Americans call them, or the invading army, or the army they fought, do they call them Canadians or British? And how do the Canadians or British view that army? Were they British or Canadian? Please let me know in the comments. I'm really interested in that.
Of a newspaper printing house told the forces that took the city, "Be sure that all the C's are destroyed so that the rascals cannot any longer abuse my name." It's hard out there for a Cockburn. Thanks, Thoughtbubble. Given these problems, it's amazing there were any American successes, but there were. The battleship USS Constitution broke the myth of British naval invincibility when cannonballs bounced off it and earned it the nickname Old Ironsides. Oliver Hazard Perry defeated a British fleet in, of all places, Lake Erie. At the Battle of the Thames, William Henry Harrison defeated Tecumseh, and the Battle of Horseshoe Bend showed one of the reasons why Indians were defeated when Andrew Jackson played one group of Creeks against another group of Creeks and Cherokees. 800 Indians were killed in that battle. And speaking of Jackson, the most notable American victory of the war was the Battle of New Orleans, which catapulted him to prominence.
Yeah, actually, New Orleans, there's the Mississippi River, and as we saw in the video about the American Civil War, the Mississippi River, or rivers in general, were very vital to trade and economic prosperity, and New Orleans as a port city where the Mississippi River flows to is actually really important, because if you control New Orleans, then you control what goes inside and outside of the Mississippi. So New Orleans was actually fought in this war and in the Civil War, and a pretty important city.
He lost only 71 men while inflicting 2,036 British casualties. Of course, the most memorable thing about the battle was that it took place 2 weeks after the peace treaty ending the war had been signed, but hey, that's...
Yeah, like, imagine that you're like somewhere. I think that a treaty was signed in Ghent, so in Europe, and imagine how long it takes to come there from Ghent to the coast, and then onto a ship, then from a ship to the Americas, and then especially from, I don't know, let's say Washington until down to New Orleans. So probably, yeah.
That's not Jackson's fault. Again, no Twitter. Hashtag
No
1815 problems. The Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war, proved just how necessary
Ghent.
the war had been. Not at all. No territory changed hands. When negotiations started in August 1814, the British asked for northern Maine, demilitarization of the Great Lakes, and some territory to create an independent nation for the Indians in the Northwest. But none of that happened. Not because the U.S. was in a particularly good negotiating position, but because it would have been awkward for Great Britain to carve out pieces of the U.S. and then tell Russia and Prussia that they couldn't take pieces of Europe for themselves to celebrate their victory in the Napoleonic Wars. There were no provisions in the treaty about impressment or free trade.
Because after the Napoleonic Wars, the great powers in Europe, so Prussia, the Habsburg monarchy, Russia, and Great Britain, they wanted to restore, it's called in Latin, status quo. I forgot. It's like status quo prior bellum. So the status quo prior to the war. So they wanted to restore like the power structures that were in Europe back then, and yeah.
And basically, the treaty returned everything to the status quo, so neither the U.S. nor Britain actually won. But the Indians, who suffered significant casualties and gave up even more territory, definitely lost. So with a treaty like that, the war must have had a negligible impact on American history, right? Except no, the War of 1812 confirmed that the U.S. would exist. Britain would never invade America again until 1961. I mean, the U.S. were good customers, and Great Britain was happy to let them trade as long as
1961.
that trade wasn't helping a French dictator. The war launched Andrew Jackson's career and solidified the settlement and conquest of land east of the Mississippi River, and our lack of success in Canada reinforced Canadian nationalism while also ensuring that instead of becoming one great nation, we would forever be Canada's pants. The war also spelled the end of the Federalist Party, which tried in 1815 with the Hartford Convention to change the Constitution. In retrospect, the Hartford Convention proposals actually look pretty reasonable. They wanted to eliminate the clause wherein black people were counted as 3/5 of a human and require a 2/3 congressional majority to declare war. But because they had their convention right before Jackson's victory at New Orleans, they only came off looking unpatriotic and out of touch, as the elite so often do. It's hard to argue that Americans really won the War of 1812, but we felt like we won, and nothing unleashes national pride like war winning. The nationalistic fervor that emerged in the early 19th century was, like most things, good news for some and bad news for others. But what's important to remember, regardless of whether you're an American, is that after 1812, the United States saw itself not just as an independent nation, but as a big player on the world stage. For better and for worse, that's a gig we've held on to. And no matter how you feel about America's international interventions, you need to remember, it didn't begin in Afghanistan or even Europe. It started with freaking Canada.
It started with freaking Canada.
Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by...
Okay, I definitely learned something new. Interesting facts. But yeah, I don't know how Canadians or Americans view that. The outcome of the war, like who won, who gained what. But as he explained here, like neither the US or Canada had major gains. Like everything was back to status quo regarding territory and so on. And the only real losers, or the group that lost people and territory and whatever, were the Indians. So, yeah, very interesting. So once again, if you liked it, the video, please subscribe, hit the ring bell. If you want to support the channel in other means, we have also a Patreon account, so you can go there. And there I'm going to discuss with my Patreons what my next projects are. I have an interesting project. So if you're interested in supporting the channel and history in general, hit like, subscribe, and also visit CrashCourse and give them also a like. So, yeah, see ya.